Science! Scientific Revolution, section 1.5. I'll try not to vomit. This section disgusts me because science, bleh, who loves science? It's awful. Right, Maisie? Maisie is still here. There, Maisie is disgusted too. You heard her. But 1.5, the Scientific Revolution, big part of the Renaissance era is not just art, but it's also scientific thinking and how that changes. We're going to look at the characteristics of medieval science, reasons for the change, and the concept of the scientific revolution, what it's all about, and then we're going to look at the scientific revolution in the context of changes in conceptions of space, the body, and the mind. So that's where we are going for this section. Let's start with medieval science. He's getting rowdy. Yeah, I know. Medieval science. So scientific thinking in the Middle Ages, it really didn't exist outside of the context of religious faith. So the arbiters of religion and faith also were the arbiters of science. So you kind of had to connect them together. They're basically in the same ballpark. Explanations for the natural world. So, hey, is the sun come up? Oh, what's going? Everything was done with kind of a religious context in mind. With that in mind as well, superstition's a big part of your life. So you look at the picture there on the slide, any one of those things, you're in trouble, right? I mean, people, they saw a natural phenomenon and they thought a superstitious thing was behind it. A tree falls in the forest. Why did that happen? Oh, I stepped on a crack and broke my mother's back. I mean, these things occurred. And for medieval scientists and thinkers, in terms of space and the way that Earth was constructed, they followed a geocentric view of the universe, which meant that the Earth was the exact center point and the universe kind of developed around. So everything revolved around the Earth. Additionally, conceptions of heaven and hell existed. We talked about Dante's Inferno. That kind of is built on just the idea of hell being at the center of the world, in a place lower. And there was ideas of, the lower you go, the worse it gets. So you can see here how you go down, the indifferent, the lustful, the abyss here. Louisville fans are somewhere down around in here. And then you have traders then there at the bottom. And you just love these people having their nice middle-class life. And then below, blah, death and destruction. So heaven and hell certainly are different places, connections, and certainly a major part of people's conceptions of life. Here's a geocentric view of the universe. You have the Earth, and then you had different elements surrounding the Earth, 4 elements in particular, of earth, fire, water, and air. Basically, everything in the world is made up of these 4 things, and then you have the planets circling around, and that was justified by biblical means. There's a story from the book of Joshua in the Old Testament in which Joshua asked God to keep the sun still, so that day can continue, so the Israelites can defeat their enemies, and it doesn't become night. So the church took that reading and applied that to kind of their explanation of the natural world. They took that certainly literally. Now, this is going to start to change, though, as time goes on. As we get closer to the 14th, 15th, 16th century, conceptions of science will change. I don't know what this big rod in the middle of the screen is. We'll find out as we go. The first thing is that medieval universities start to get outside of the Catholic Church's influence. So you start to have explanations of the world in the late Middle Ages that are not done specifically by the Catholic Church, or at least influenced by the Church. And there is a very fancy man, and here you all are learning about life and so on and so forth. I don't know how these bubbles got here on the front. Whatever. It's a weird thing. Renaissance stimulates the sciences by studying ancient math. So if we remember the ancient Greek and Roman influence, there's a lot of Greeks who did a lot of maths. Perhaps you're familiar with that thing called the Pythagorean theorem, the thing that caused you so much misery. It's got Greek roots. Euclidean geometry. I think Euclid is the inventor of geometry. Don't quote me on that, but ask your friendly geometry teacher if that's the case. All those have Greek influence. They come in the Renaissance. And then we'll get to this later, but exploration causes the need to create new scientific devices. So we got to figure out where we're going. How do we get to point A to point B? Can't pick this thing up yet for another 600 years. Let's get our friendly compass out and plot our track from there. So the creation for new scientific tools because exploration demanded the need to be able to sail the high seas. So that brings us to what we call the scientific revolution. And we're going to date it in between the 16th and 18th century. Just like the Renaissance, we really can't say, oh, this is when it started. It's not like somebody one day stepped outside and said, science! You know, it didn't happen that way. Scientific discoveries pick up and continue on to the 18th century. A sweeping change in views of the universe, but here's kind of the big key is that these scientists were looking to explain God's creation. They're not necessarily non-religious. They're not secular in any means. They're explaining what God had created around them and how that might have differed from how the church explained it. So, again, we've already talked about humanism as a way of maybe escaping the church's grasp, putting potential in human beings. Now these scientists are going to say, okay, well, we're going to try to explain the world that maybe God has created. It's not what the church says. Of course, we looked at new monarchs who are trying to take political powers away from the clergy in their home countries. So there's three reasons right away only in this unit where we can say, okay, the church is losing influence. How's my hair? Is it okay? I feel like I'm okay. It's all right. It's fine. It's a good haircut. So we're going to look at the space, body, and mind in terms of how the scientific revolution played out. Space is a really easy concept. You got a guy named Nicholas Copernicus, not Copernicus, like some fools like to pronounce it. It's Copernicus, a Polish astronomer who's got maybe one of the worst haircuts I've ever seen. Mine's better than his. He promotes what we call the heliocentric view. Now, the heliocentric view is totally different than geocentric. Heliocentric, helium. Helium is found in what? That's right, the sun. He's going to say that the sun is the center of the universe and not Earth. Now, who gives a crap about that? Earth, sun, doesn't matter. It turns out they're both wrong, at least how we see it in 2017 as I'm recording this. But the reason why this is a big deal is that Copernicus is challenging the authority of the church to declare truth on scientific matters. And he's so worried about that is that Copernicus doesn't publish his findings till right before he dies. So he's about to die, and then he publishes, so he doesn't have to experience the blowback. But his book on the revolutions of heavenly spheres, 1543, really goes out there and says, hey, listen, I think the church does this wrong. I think the sun is the center of the universe and not Earth. And certainly that's not what we see today, because we know we're not in the middle of our universe, but that's how Copernicus viewed it, and it was certainly a big change. Because it challenged the teaching of the church. Does the church really care about the heliocentric theory and the scientific truth behind it? No, I don't think so. But they do care about somebody saying that they are wrong about something. So keep that in mind for later. Let's get to a second guy, Galilei. He is our second figure. You've probably heard of Galileo, a good song by Queen, right, Maisie? Looks like she spit up a little bit. We'll deal with that in a second. I'm not a bad parent, but, Maisie, we've got to talk about science. Yeah, I know. Yeah. She's smiling. She's okay. Don't worry. Well, we'll talk about Galileo here. So Galileo is going to affirm Copernicus's views on the heliocentric theory. Doesn't really say that on the slide, but he does that. He also goes into the laws of physics. Again, trying to explain God's creation. The law of inertia, laws of motion. His big belief is that God has given us a brain to think and reason, and his beliefs, particularly the heliocentric theory, gets him into hot water with the church, and the church brings him to trial. It's a part of the Royal Inquisition, which we introduced with the new monarchs. So that's in the early 17th century that Galileo has done that. And we'll kind of look into that episode one more in class, but he actually is put on trial and sentenced to house arrest after recanting his beliefs or going against him, saying he was wrong to begin with. So again, geo to helio, at the end of the day, I mean, you really don't have to know. This isn't science class, thank the Lord. But what you do need to know is what social, political impact does that have, cultural impact does that have on the church as people start to suggest truths about the universe that maybe the church doesn't endorse. Of course, Galileo is also famous for that weird tower in Italy, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Not pizza, Pisa, P-I-S-A. Different conceptions of the body in the medieval era. There was a dude named Galen who lived, as you can say, way back, who really started to draw up in the even pre-medieval era kind of how the body was structured. It promoted something that was called the four humors design, that our body was split up basically into four different liquids, and not so dissimilar to how the medieval view of the elements kind of came together. His basically basic ideas about human anatomy are similar to animal anatomy. For example, we'll get to that scary man in a minute. He believed that we had an equal number of stomachs as certainly a cow does, which I believe is 4. So in any case, ideas of anatomy are very non-accurate in the medieval era and even before. Now we get into the Renaissance. We're trying to explain God's creation, and we have drawings. This is by Da Vinci. Human anatomy, certainly detailed and shows humanistically the individual detail that certainly the art portrayed. I might have to sneeze. Okay, if I sneeze, just, sometimes you're like, you got a sneeze coming. It doesn't come. I know, it's frustrating. Hold on. Oh, man. Yeah, oh, man, I might have to sneeze again. I'm sorry. Okay, anyway, Da Vinci, anatomy, detail. You got a couple other figures who chase this. Vesalius, there he is, renews the study of human anatomy. Him and Da Vinci both stole cadavers, dead bodies, to study human anatomy. By the way, that's totally illegal. Couldn't do that. They got away with it, I guess. They're dead, man. William Harvey comes along a little bit later. This is an English scientist. And he's going to explain the circulatory system. So the next time the health teacher tries to teach you about this, say, oh, William Harvey, he knows it all. Explained how the blood was pumped by the heart, circulated through the body. So it just basically updates and gives an idea of how the body works. Now, maybe a question that we could have started with is, for the mind, source of truth in the Middle Ages. Where do people go for truth? They certainly went to religious texts, the Bible, early church writings. Also, with the Renaissance, the advent of the Renaissance, you have people start to go to Greek and Roman sources. I know, amazing. That, though, kind of overrates the simple fact for a lot of the normal people in early modern Europe, Middle Ages. They're going to look for bread. It's all about feeding your family. So it's not, the scientific revolution, Renaissance, all this stuff is impacting the higher ups, right? Our pyramid. Okay, just a second. I know. I think we're going to have to take a short break here. Bear with me. We'll be back in a second and talk about more bread. Okay, we're joined by a special guest here who's going to ride out the rest of this with me. Does that sound good? Okay. So normal people basically are like, hey, just give me my bread. I don't really care about truth. The truth is what I can feed my family with. As long as I have that, I really don't care how we get to truth at all. So that's something to consider when we go over people like Francis Bacon. Oh, I love bacon. It's great. Oh, look at that. That's awesome. Francis Bacon begins to do some writings 15th or 16th, 17th century. And he introduces this idea called inductive reasoning. It basically says that the only way to figure things out is by our own experiments or experiences. We find truth by what happens to us. So instead of accepting truth from a higher authority figure, just verbatim, right? We experience it for ourselves. We build that knowledge from our own senses. So, for example, I go outside, everything's white, it's cold, I almost slip and fall. What can I tell myself? It's winter, okay? The season's winter. Winter is coming. Game of Thrones, shout out. So that's something that we can think about there in terms of inductive reasoning. It's also called empiricism. So you'll hear that term referred to as well empiric thinking. We find out truth from what we experience. All right? So we gather proof and then we come to a conclusion. Gather data through the senses, I just told you. There's another philosopher in the scientific revolution named Rene Descartes. And Descartes' belief system is a little bit different. Very subtle difference. It's called deductive reasoning. He says we're going to start with a theory and then we have to prove it. So I want you to look around your room and see if you can find a chair. Maybe it's what you're sitting in right now. It's what I'm sitting in. Now, how do we know that's a chair? Okay, well, we look at the different components about it, and then we eventually test it out and come to it and knowing it is, okay? I'm holding Maisie here. Maisie, are you a baby? That's our theory. Well, she spits up, she smiles a lot, and she poops all the time. You sound like a baby, right? So that's deductive reasoning. You doubt a theory at first. I don't know if this is a baby or not, but guess what? I'm going to run the test. I'm going to check off the boxes, and it looks like you're a baby. Is that right? That's right. So that's how again, it's all about not accepting the truth as what's told to you verbatim. And that's where Descartes' famous saying, I think, therefore I am. So the fact that he is thinking proves that he is a person. So he's like, do I exist? Well, I'm thinking right now, so yes, I do. If I stop thinking, then I must not exist. And for some of you in class sometimes, I'm thinking you are not a real person because you're not thinking at all. So you got to figure things out logically. And these two systems are brought together to form our modern scientific revolution. This is, or scientific method, rather. This is a good chart, kind of shows the progression of thinking from deductive to inductive. You're not going to need to know this in depth, but know generally each process what it's all about. Getting to truth, deductive is doubting, and inductive, you have to prove your experiences to come to a conclusion. And there's another chart to look at that. Now, all these three different ways of thinking are going to be brought together by a man named Isaac Newton, who's going to put together the conception of how the world is set up in his book called Principia. This is in the early 18th century. Newton himself said that he walked on the or stood on the shoulders of giants, meaning that without those who came before him, he would not have been able to come up with his system of belief. And then that apple falls down on his head. It's always a funny time when it does that. I think it should here soon, or maybe not. Maybe it gets spoken. So he's standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, what's his big thought? His big thought is that the world and the universe is governed by natural laws that are constant and unchanging. That God has set up things like laws of inertia, force, motion, the heliocentric theory for that matter, and also a thing called gravity, that if I hold something up, the earth is pulling it down toward it. So basically the thought is that Newton sees the world as a giant machine created by God, but God has created it and perhaps doesn't need to be involved in the world's events. If he set up the machine to work easily, governed by these natural laws, does God need to be present? I'm not saying that God doesn't exist. That's not what Newton's saying. But he's saying, does God need to exist? That when that tree falls in the forest, why is it falling? Is it God's intervention? Maybe not. So, of course, universal gravitation is his big theory, but the big idea behind the theory is that big thought there, that the world and the universe is governed by natural laws that are constant and unchanging. It's very mechanistic, meaning a big machine. Things are set up the way they are, and things make sense. So that is basically Newtonian physics for you. Go take that AP physics test now. You'll be ready. So that's all science. Thank the Lord. We're going to go probably change a diaper, but you need to understand for Unit 1, all these processes are working at about the same time, 1.2 through 1.5 specifically. It's all happening concurrently. Different things, but all with a certain theme. And that theme is challenging the authority of the placeholders or the power holders in society, particularly the Catholic Church, of which we will talk much more about in Unit 2. I'll shut it down for 1.5. We'll go change the diaper. We're waving bye. We'll see you next time.